October 1, 2021. Groveland Township, Michigan. 64-year-old Konrad Imirowicz lies sleeping in his own bed, unaware that his daughter is in the kitchen, mixing a deadly cocktail of lye, water, and drain cleaner. It's just days before her 18th birthday, and Megan Imirowicz is furious. Her father had been drinking and refused to drive her to the hair salon for her party preparations. Most teenagers would slam a door, cry, or call a friend for a ride. Megan Imirowicz chose murder. In the quiet darkness of that October night, she would carry that toxic mixture to her father's bedside and pour it over his sleeping form, watching as the caustic chemicals ate through his skin, his muscle, his very flesh, beginning a 5-month journey of unimaginable agony that would end with Konrad's death and transform his daughter from a spoiled teenager into one of the most cold-blooded killers in recent memory. But this isn't just a story about a moment of rage that went too far. This is the story of how a single act of selfish cruelty exposed a young woman's complete lack of humanity, how the justice system struggled to comprehend such calculated evil from someone barely old enough to vote, and how a father's love couldn't save him from the monster living in his own home. To understand how Megan Joyce Imirowicz became a killer on the eve of her 18th birthday, we need to understand the toxic dynamics that had been brewing in the Imirowicz household for years. Konrad Imirowicz was 64 years old, a man who had worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. Those who knew him described him as a gentle soul who had struggled with alcohol but was trying to maintain a relationship with his daughter despite the challenges that addiction brought to their household. Megan, on the other hand, was described by those who knew her as entitled, volatile, and prone to explosive anger when she didn't get her way. At 17, turning 18, she displayed the kind of narcissistic rage that would have been concerning in any context, but became lethal when combined with access to household chemicals and a sleeping victim. The relationship between father and daughter had been deteriorating for months, possibly years. The conviction stems from a 2021 incident when the teen's father, Konrad Imirowicz, was allegedly drunk and unable to drive her to the hair salon shortly before her 18th birthday party, prompting her to attack him. But this wasn't just an isolated incident of teenage rebellion. The evidence that would emerge during the investigation and trial would paint a picture of a young woman whose capacity for empathy and human connection had been fundamentally broken, who viewed other people, even her own father, as objects to be used for her convenience or destroyed when they became obstacles to her desires. October 1, 2021, should have been a day of celebration and preparation. Megan was planning her 18th birthday party, looking forward to the milestone that would mark her official transition to adulthood. She wanted to go to the hair salon to prepare for the festivities, to look perfect for what she saw as one of the most important days of her young life. When Konrad, who had been drinking, refused to drive her to the appointment, most teenagers would have been disappointed, frustrated, even angry. They might have called friends, used rideshare services, or simply postponed the appointment. They would not have seen their father's inability to drive as a capital offense deserving of the death penalty. But Megan Imirowicz was not most teenagers. Instead of finding an alternative solution to her transportation problem, Megan made a decision that would reveal the depths of her callousness and cruelty. She went to the kitchen and began mixing a toxic cocktail that would serve as both weapon and torture device. Megan Imirowicz is accused of creating a deadly mixture of drain cleaner, using lye and water, throwing it on her father, leaving him unconscious, and ultimately killing him. But the clinical description of creating a deadly mixture doesn't capture the premeditation, the calculation, and the sheer malice required to turn household cleaning products into instruments of torture. Lye is one of the most caustic substances commonly found in homes. It's used in drain cleaners because of its ability to dissolve organic matter, hair, grease, food particles. When mixed with water and applied to human skin, it doesn't just burn, it dissolves flesh, muscle, and tissue with a chemical reaction that continues until the substance is completely removed or neutralized. Megan knew this. She had to know this. And yet she carefully mixed the solution, carried it to her father's bedroom, and made the conscious decision to pour it over his sleeping form. The moment that mixture touched Konrad's skin, his fate was sealed. The chemical reaction began immediately, eating through his flesh while he slept, beginning a process of destruction that would consume his body over the next 5 months until it finally claimed his life. But in that moment, as she stood over her father's bed watching the chemicals do their work, Megan Imirowicz had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. She had moved from being a difficult teenager to being a cold-blooded killer. The immediate aftermath of Megan's attack revealed the calculated nature of her crime and the shocking extent of her indifference to her father's suffering. He was later found by a neighbor with chemical burns throughout his body. Konrad died in a hospital after being removed from life support roughly 5 months after the attack. The fact that a neighbor found Konrad, rather than Megan calling for help, speaks volumes about her mindset in the moments after her attack. She had doused her father with caustic chemicals and then apparently left him to suffer alone, making no effort to call emergency services, render aid, or even check on his condition. When first responders arrived at the scene, they found Konrad Imirowicz in a condition that would haunt experienced emergency medical personnel for the rest of their careers. The victim was taken to the hospital for chemical burns across his body. But chemical burns across his body is a clinical description that fails to capture the horror of what Konrad experienced. Live burns don't just affect the surface of the skin. They continue burning through tissue, muscle, and even bone until the chemical is neutralized or removed. The pain is described by medical professionals as among the worst that human beings can experience, and it continues for hours or days until proper treatment can halt the chemical reaction. What followed was 5 months of unimaginable suffering that would test the limits of medical science and human endurance. He needed kidney dialysis, a tracheotomy, and had both legs amputated before dying 5 months later. Think about that for a moment. Konrad Imirowicz endured kidney failure requiring dialysis. He needed a tracheotomy to breathe. The damage to his legs was so severe that both had to be amputated. For 5 months, he fought for his life while his body was systematically destroyed by the chemicals his own daughter had poured on him. During this entire period, as her father fought for survival in the hospital, Megan continued with her life. She celebrated her 18th birthday. She went about her daily routine. She gave interviews to investigators with the same casual indifference she might have shown when discussing the weather. In a cell phone video presented as trial evidence, Megan claimed various justifications for her actions, but none of her explanations could account for the sheer brutality of what she had done or her apparent lack of remorse about her father's suffering. The medical professionals treating Konrad were dealing with injuries unlike anything in their experience. Chemical burns from lye are among the most difficult injuries to treat because the burning continues long after the initial contact. Every day brought new complications, new surgeries, new attempts to save whatever parts of Konrad's body could still be salvaged. But despite the heroic efforts of medical personnel, the damage was too extensive. He died 5 months later on March 6, 2022, 3 days after he was taken off life support. The decision to remove life support was made by medical professionals and family members who recognized that Konrad's suffering had reached a point where recovery was impossible. For 3 days after the machines were turned off, his body fought to maintain life, a testament to his strength and will to survive. When Konrad finally died on March 6, 2022, he had endured 157 days of agony that began when his daughter decided that her hair appointment was more important than his life. But even as her father lay dying, even as the legal system prepared to hold her accountable for her actions, Megan Imirowicz showed no signs of the remorse, guilt, or grief that would be expected from someone who had caused such devastating harm to a family member. The monster who had mixed lye and water in her kitchen that October night had revealed herself completely, and the justice system was about to learn just how difficult it can be to punish someone who appears to be completely devoid of human empathy. The investigation into Konrad Imirowicz's death was both straightforward and deeply disturbing. The physical evidence was clear, the perpetrator was known, and the method was undisputed. What challenged investigators was trying to understand how an 18-year-old could commit such a calculated, brutal crime against her own father. Since her arrest in October 2021, was found guilty last month of domestic violence and unlawful possession or use of harmful devices or irritants causing death in connection with the case. But the timeline of the investigation reveals how long it took for the full horror of Megan's actions to become clear. Initially, investigators treated the incident as a potential accident or a case of domestic violence that had escalated beyond anyone's intentions. The idea that an 18-year-old would deliberately torture her father with caustic chemicals seemed too monstrous to be credible, even to experienced homicide investigators. But as they delved deeper into the evidence, a different picture emerged. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage that had gone too far. This was a premeditated attack carried out with full knowledge of the consequences. The evidence showed that Megan had deliberately mixed the lye solution, understanding its caustic properties. She had carried it to her father's bedroom while he was sleeping and defenseless. She had poured it over his body with the full knowledge that it would cause excruciating pain and potentially fatal injuries. Most damning was what the investigation revealed about Megan's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Rather than calling for emergency help, rather than attempting to neutralize the chemicals or render aid, she had apparently left her father to suffer alone while the caustic solution continued its destructive work. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation was deeply troubling. Megan showed no signs of mental illness, intellectual disability, or psychological trauma that might explain or mitigate her actions. She was simply a young woman who appeared to be completely lacking in empathy, remorse, or basic human compassion. Investigators interviewed friends, family members, teachers, and others who had known Megan throughout her life. While some described her as difficult or entitled, none had observed behavior that would have predicted such extreme violence. She had hidden her capacity for calculated cruelty behind a facade of normal teenage behavior. The investigation also revealed the extent of Konrad's suffering during his final months. Medical records documented the progression of his injuries, the multiple surgeries, the amputations, the organ failure, and the desperate attempts to save his life. Each page of medical documentation served as evidence of Megan's callousness and the devastating consequences of her actions. But perhaps most disturbing to investigators was Megan's demeanor during questioning. She showed none of the emotional distress, guilt, or remorse that would be expected from someone who had caused such harm to a family member. Her responses were matter-of-fact, self-justifying, and focused primarily on minimizing her own legal exposure rather than acknowledging her father's suffering. The investigation culminated in formal charges that reflected the severity of Megan's crimes. A Michigan teenager is facing upgraded charges of murder after her father succumbed to injuries he suffered last year when she allegedly doused him with drain cleaner. The upgrade to murder charges came after Konrad's death in March 2022, transforming the case from aggravated assault to homicide. Unlawful possession or use of harmful devices/irritants causing death is a felony punishable by life imprisonment or any term of years and/or a fine up to $40,000. The legal framework struggled to capture the unique horror of Megan's crime. Traditional categories like domestic violence or assault with a dangerous weapon seemed inadequate to describe someone who had turned her own home into a torture chamber and her sleeping father into a victim of calculated chemical warfare. As the case moved toward trial, investigators and prosecutors faced the challenge of helping a jury understand not just what Megan had done, but the level of premeditation, cruelty, and callousness required to carry out such an attack on one's own family member. The evidence was clear, but the psychology behind it remained deeply disturbing and largely incomprehensible to those tasked with seeking justice for Konrad Imirowicz. When Megan Joyce Imirowicz finally faced a jury in 2023, prosecutors were tasked with helping 12 ordinary citizens understand a crime that defied comprehension: how a daughter could torture her own father to death over something as trivial as a ride to the hair salon. A Michigan jury found Megan Joyce Imirowicz, 19, guilty on charges of domestic violence and unlawful possession or use of harmful devices/irritants causing death, according to a release from the Office of the Prosecuting Attorney of Oakland County. The trial itself was a study in contrasts. On one side, prosecutors presented a methodical case built on irrefutable physical evidence, medical testimony, and documentation of Konrad's 5-month journey from victim to corpse. On the other, defense attorneys struggled to find any narrative that could make Megan's actions comprehensible to a jury of her peers. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. They walked the jury through the events of October 1, 2021, step by step. Megan's anger over being denied a ride to the hair salon. Her decision to go to the kitchen and mix lye with water. Her journey to her father's bedroom. The deliberate act of pouring caustic chemicals over his sleeping form. Medical experts testified about the nature of lye burns, explaining how the chemical reaction literally dissolves human tissue on contact and continues burning until neutralized. They described Konrad's injuries in clinical detail. The percentage of his body that was burned, the depth of tissue damage, the organs affected, and the months of agony he endured before his death. Perhaps most powerful was the timeline evidence that showed Megan's behavior after the attack. Rather than calling for help, she had left her father to suffer alone. When neighbors eventually discovered him and called emergency services, Megan showed no signs of distress, remorse, or concern for his welfare. The defense faced an impossible task. How do you defend someone who tortured their own father to death over a hair appointment? How do you generate sympathy for a defendant who showed no mercy to her victim and no remorse for her actions? Defense attorneys attempted to paint Megan as a troubled teenager who had acted impulsively in a moment of rage. They suggested that she hadn't fully understood the consequences of her actions, that she was immature and had made a terrible mistake rather than committing a calculated murder. But the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. Mixing lye and water requires deliberate action. Carrying the mixture to someone's bedroom requires intent. Pouring it over a sleeping person requires malice aforethought. Every step of Megan's actions demonstrated conscious choice and full awareness of the harm she was inflicting. The jury heard testimony about Konrad's character, a man who had struggled with alcohol but was trying to maintain a relationship with his daughter despite their difficulties. He was described as gentle, non-violent, and devoted to Megan despite her behavioral problems. In contrast, the portrait that emerged of Megan was of a young woman who was narcissistic, entitled, and prone to explosive rage when denied what she wanted. Friends and family members testified about her volatile behavior, her lack of empathy for others, and her tendency to view people as objects to be used for her convenience. The defense's attempts to generate sympathy for Megan were undermined by her own behavior during the trial. She showed no visible emotion when confronted with evidence of her father's suffering. She displayed no remorse when medical experts described his injuries in graphic detail. She appeared more concerned with her own legal consequences than with the pain she had caused. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of controlled outrage. They walked the jury through Konrad's final months: the surgeries, the amputations, the dialysis, the tracheotomy, the desperate fight to survive injuries inflicted by his own daughter. They contrasted his suffering with Megan's callous indifference, her continuation of normal activities while he lay dying in the hospital. Megan Joyce Imirowicz was found guilty of throwing chemicals on her sleeping father, Konrad Imirowicz, in 2021, which killed him 5 months later. The jury's verdict came swiftly, suggesting that they had little difficulty seeing through any attempts to minimize or excuse Megan's actions. The evidence was too clear, the premeditation too obvious, and the cruelty too extreme to generate any sympathy for the defendant. But the conviction was only the beginning. Now the court system faced the challenge of crafting a sentence that could somehow address the magnitude of Megan's crime while acknowledging that she was still technically a teenager when she committed murder. July 25, 2023. The sentencing hearing for Megan Imirowicz would prove to be almost as controversial as her crime itself, revealing deep divisions in how the justice system handles cases involving young offenders who commit unthinkably brutal crimes. Imirowicz had faced the prospect of up to life behind bars and a possible fine of $40,000, according to prosecutors. Given the horrific nature of her crime and the complete lack of remorse she had displayed, many observers expected a sentence that would reflect the severity of torturing one's own father to death. Instead, the sentence shocked everyone in the courtroom. Facing a possible lifetime in prison after an Oakland County jury convicted her of unlawful possession or use of harmful devices, imitation/irritants, causing death, Megan Imirowicz was sentenced to 1 year in jail with credit for 506 days followed by 5 years of probation. Read that again. 1 year in jail with credit for time already served for torturing her father to death with caustic chemicals. The sentence meant that Megan would serve virtually no additional time behind bars for one of the most brutal patricides in recent memory. The courtroom erupted in stunned silence. Prosecutors, who had sought a substantial prison term, were visibly shocked. Family members of Konrad struggled to comprehend how someone who had caused such unspeakable suffering could receive what amounted to a suspended sentence. The defendant served 506 days in jail. She was placed on probation for 5 years with extensive conditions including a tether. The judge's rationale focused on Megan's age at the time of the crime, her lack of prior criminal history, and the possibility of rehabilitation. But critics pointed out that Megan had shown no signs of remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and no indication that she understood the magnitude of what she had done to her father. How could someone be rehabilitated who didn't seem to recognize that rehabilitation was necessary? The sentence became a lightning rod for broader debates about justice, punishment, and the appropriate response to juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Megan had been 17 when she mixed the lye solution, but 18 when she poured it on her father, technically an adult by legal standards, but still young enough for the court to consider her developmental immaturity. Supporters of the sentence argued that harsh punishment wouldn't bring Konrad back and that a young offender deserved a chance at rehabilitation. They pointed to research showing that brain development continues into the mid-20s and that teenagers are more likely to engage in impulsive behavior. But critics argued that this wasn't impulsive behavior, it was calculated, premeditated torture that demonstrated a fundamental lack of humanity. They questioned whether someone capable of such cruelty could ever be safely reintegrated into society, regardless of their age. The controversy intensified when it became clear that Meghan would be released almost immediately. Teen convicted of throwing lie on father leading to his death released from jail became a headline that generated outrage across social media and traditional news outlets. The case drew comparisons to other instances where young offenders received lenient sentences for serious crimes, raising questions about consistency in the justice system and the appropriate balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Most troubling to many observers was Meghan's apparent lack of accountability. She had never acknowledged responsibility for her father's death, never expressed genuine remorse, and never demonstrated any understanding of the pain she had caused. Yet she was being released back into the community with minimal supervision. The probation conditions were extensive, including electronic monitoring and regular check-ins with probation officers. But critics questioned whether any amount of supervision could prevent someone with such a demonstrated capacity for violence from striking again. The sentence would face legal challenges, with prosecutors arguing that it was inadequate given the severity of the crime. But for now, Meghan Imirowicz was free, having served less than 2 years for torturing her father to death. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple: had justice been served, or had the system failed Konrad Imirowicz one final time? The controversial sentence in the Meghan Imirowicz case sparked immediate legal challenges and public outcry that would continue for years after her release from jail. The Michigan Court of Appeals declined to overturn Meghan Imirowicz's 17-month sentence for killing her father with lie. The appeals court's decision came after prosecutors had challenged the original sentence as inadequately reflecting the severity of the crime. "We acknowledge that the victim's resulting injuries and death were tragic and that defendant's conduct was reprehensible," the appeals court wrote. But they concluded that the trial judge had acted within their discretionary authority in crafting what they considered an individualized sentence. The appeals court decision provided insight into the judicial reasoning behind the controversial sentence, but it did little to satisfy those who believed justice had not been served. The court acknowledged the horrific nature of Konrad's suffering while simultaneously upholding a sentence that many viewed as a slap on the wrist. For Meghan herself, the appeals process meant continued scrutiny and public attention. Media coverage of her case had transformed her from a relatively unknown teenager into a symbol of privileged youth who escape consequences for their actions. Her name became synonymous with the failures of a justice system that many believed was too lenient on young offenders who commit serious crimes. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond Meghan's individual circumstances. Legal experts debated whether the sentence established a dangerous precedent for future cases involving juvenile offenders who commit violent crimes. If someone could torture their own father to death and receive essentially a suspended sentence, what message did that send to other potential offenders? The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs for individuals who show no remorse for their actions. Traditional rehabilitation models assume that offenders acknowledge wrongdoing and want to change their behavior. But Meghan had never demonstrated either acknowledgement or desire for change. Mental health professionals who followed the case were divided on whether someone with Meghan's apparent psychological profile could be successfully rehabilitated. Some argued that her youth offered hope for change and growth. Others suggested that her complete lack of empathy indicated a fundamental personality disorder that might be resistant to treatment. The victim impact on Konrad's extended family and friends continued long after the legal proceedings concluded. They had watched someone they loved suffer for 5 months before dying from injuries inflicted by his own daughter, only to see that daughter receive a sentence that seemed to minimize the severity of her crime. For the broader community, the case served as a disturbing reminder that evil could exist within seemingly normal families. The idea that a teenager could calmly mix caustic chemicals and pour them over her sleeping father challenged basic assumptions about human nature and family bonds. The media attention also meant that Meghan's story became educational content, featured in documentaries and true crime programs that analyzed her case for audiences fascinated by extreme criminal behavior. While this attention served to educate people about warning signs and family violence, it also meant that Meghan's crime would follow her indefinitely. As time passed, questions remained about Meghan's current status and behavior. Was she complying with her probation conditions? Had she shown any signs of remorse or personal growth? Was she participating in counseling or treatment programs that might address whatever psychological factors had contributed to her crime? The probation system's confidentiality requirements meant that these questions remained largely unanswered, leaving the public to wonder whether the justice system's gamble on rehabilitation was paying off or whether Megan remained a potential danger to others. The Megan Imirowicz case had become more than just a criminal prosecution. It had become a referendum on justice, punishment, rehabilitation, and the complex challenges facing a legal system that must balance accountability with the possibility of redemption.